All right, Battlefleet Gothic. This one's a good story, actually. When I first joined Games Workshop in 1990, Richard Halliwell was actually working on Battlefleet Gothic. There'd been a ton of development work done for it, plastic miniatures even, and artwork and so on. And he was working on a game which basically used like a grid system, and it was Imperials versus Eldar. And because I was sproggling around the place and in the office next door, he used me to playtest it a few times. And I really liked the idea of it. I didn't like the game he'd done very much, and it didn't end up going anywhere, which I was sad about because the imagery was great. Let me just have a look in this book and see if I can dig it up. Because Jez Goodwin had done some crew for these spaceships on the Imperial side, obviously, and a bunch of different concept art for it as well. Eldar and Imperials. Actually, they're all Imperials. Eldar are in a different place in the book, in the Eldar section. Anyway, so it was just like, in many ways, it was like Confrontation and Necromunda, in that it lay moribund for a long time, despite having stuff done for it. And I kind of chiseled away in the background, trying to come up with ideas about how to make Battlefleet Gothic happen. Because I did a lot of work on Epic at the time, and it seemed like a natural continuation to me that you'd also have a spaceship game, just like you had a big scale ground game and a small scale sort of skirmishy ground game as well. It all made perfect sense in my own head. So I was always really keen, and I love the imagery. So, little bobblehead you can see down here, struggling with his weight on the base. This is a ship I built, I scratch built it out of pieces. You can probably identify various Epic tank turrets and things like that on there, to kind of demonstrate how cool a miniature would be for Battlefleet Gothic. It's called the Righteous Endeavour, because that's what I thought it was. And Jez actually helped me out by this. He sculpted me the prow. The main core of it is a stick of MDF with things stuck to it, and there's all kinds of things. There's hair curlers and things stuck on it as well. And that was just there to go like, look, these are like giant armoured choo-choo trains in space with guns. You know, you just can't get cooler than this. We have to make this game. And as you can see, I mean, it's assisted by me painting them as the same fleet, but these are the actual plastic miniatures we ended up with that were in the box set many years later, which, to my great pleasure, have kept that aesthetic and has carried it through to modern times as well. So I was in love with the imagery, and it was all, for me, it was all about getting a mechanism to make a game work on that level, and what that game might be. Because, as I say, Hal's square-based thing wasn't too keen on. Jervis kind of resurrected a lot of the spaceships that have been done for it in metal, the plastics, and some assorted other ranges that Citadel had picked up over the years, old spaceship games. Because to put further context in, I've been into spaceship games. It was one of the first sci-fi things I really got into. Encounter 1 and then Starfleet Battles, which is a Star Trek based game. All box crossing off games, and interesting in ideas and not very much fun to play as a rule of thumb. Starfleet Battles is alright on a certain level, but then it gets a bit mad later on, which kind of demonstrated something about development to me for later years. But I always loved this, and I always wanted to make it happen. And I say Spacefleet didn't do it for me either. Again, it was on a grid, it was kind of small scale. What I wanted was, I came to realise, the Battle of Jutland in space, which, if you don't know, the Battle of Jutland happens in World War I, after the big sort of like arms race that you get between Germany and Great Britain about who can build the most dreadnoughts. They actually have one clash out in the North Sea and throw metal at each other over the course of the afternoon, and the Germans retreat at the end, but they've blown up more British ships, so the Germans say they've won. The Brits say they've won because they've driven the opposing fleet out of the sea, which was true, they never came out again. But if you read up on the battle itself, it's just this insane, giant mechanical beasts hurtling across the ocean for their time, flinging shells at each other with not a tremendous amount of accuracy, more on the German side, it must be said. And that was kind of my inspiration for how I would like Battlefleet Gothic to feel as a game when it was being played. a lot more Battle of Jutland and less sort of like Star Trek is really what it came down to, which was a bit of a controversial thought at the time for spaceship games, but it seemed appropriate. So eventually, I started building models for it. I worked out one game that was a bit of a bust, where it used a card system, because we were really into upfront in the studio at the time, which worked on a kind of abstract system where you kind of like were at a range and then you played cards to close the range and attack and things like that, which I found interesting. But again, it didn't scratch the itch. What I actually wound up doing, we did Epic 40,000 as a rule set, as a redo of that big scale ground game. And I took the mechanics from there and I said, why not just use these mechanics? You know they work. Apply them across and do spaceships with them instead. And that's how I got to what was eventually put in White Dwarf. What the hell is the date on this? 99. Jesus Christ. Not how I remember it. Okay. So, April 99. Having had a vague promise that we'd do it in the years before, and I developed the game to quite a pitch. Got very upset when it got pulled off the schedule again, and kind of one of the compensations was to do something in White Dwarf and just put the rules out there, which was really good. I'd not really done anything like that before, of like going, all right, here's a game I'm playing around with, tell me what you think, folks. And I got really great feedback off people. Not anything compared to what you end up with today, where everyone can reach you at the click of a button, because they actually had to write me letters and things like this. But the feedback I got was that people generally liked it, and the big thing that was missing, which I shouldn't have been surprised by, was kind of like small fighters and carriers, which obviously they aren't in the Battle of Jutland. The closest thing you get is a Zeppelin. But because of the imagery of like Battlestar Galactica and Star Wars, those, which ironically are based on World War II, that imagery of like little space fighters and bombers was absolutely in people's brains, particularly Americans, of course, because for them World War II was a carrier war in the Pacific. That's what naval war is. Battleships are old hat. They get bombed by things. That's old technology. So one of the challenges was then to try and merge in this idea of fighters and bombers, which wasn't too bad, because we already had torpedoes, because they're a big factor as you get into World War I, of like, oh, you know, I've got these tens of thousands of tons of warship, but all it takes is one piddly little torpedo and the whole thing can go down, which was a big quantum shift at the time. So it was really a case of just adapting what I'd already got going on a little bit for torpedoes and making them more like intelligent torpedoes, and then a counter to that. So that got stitched in, thanks to, you know, public feedback, crowd feedback, because it had never even crossed my tiny brain that it would be such a big factor in people's perception of sci-fi. But thinking about it is bloody obvious, really, isn't it? But that just shows you the little corners you get yourself into. Anyway, so I got feedback on that, and then we got clearance to actually do the game, which was a huge amount of excitement for me. The reason I'm getting confused about when this came out is because it was written a considerable point before then. Then it came out, and I carried on chiseling away on this, and then came back based on feedback on that and did some more work on the core rules. But this had been going on all along, and like I say, it got pulled, and then I was upset, and then it got put back on the schedule again, mainly because Rick realised that we were coming to the end of doing 2 games a year and that kind of thing, and the days of like, we only do Warhammer and Warhammer 40k and Lord of the Rings were coming. I was blissfully unaware of this at this point. So it was I didn't know it at the time, but it was a last dance for the studio to go and do something very different. Not entirely a last dance, because I mean, Gav went on and did Inquisitor as well after this. But it was one of the last ones. And for me, it was the first time I'd done a game which was entirely sprung from me, in effect, that come up with the core game and the proposals for it and managed the whole thing from end to end. Every other thing I'd done, Rick was the main designer. I was just the lead developer, really, on putting stuff together for it. So this was very much my baby, and it came out great. It really came out great. I was so happy with it. knock over the box. Lovely bit of front cover artwork, can draw attention to that. But I was going to say about having the rule book, which we made sideways just to be different, but also primarily because we knew one of the main things we'd be showing was long ships. I'm trying to find a page with a long ship on it. And it would just suit that artwork better to have that long scale format, plus the book would actually lie open when you put it on the tabletop. So we adopted that slightly strange thing. Wayne England was a great force in doing a lot of the great artwork for it, and Des Hanley in particular really came forward, did some great art. But all of the artists kicked ass, it must be said.
They really like hit the aesthetic, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. But because this is what I'd always felt about it. I felt it was a winning aesthetic in the first place because you're taking those elements of like Napoleonics and, you know, very sort of colonial era warships and Gothic it all up a bit, putting cathedrals on the top, and yes,
and it ties in with the grim dark.
It so does, does, and there's something very symbolic against a hostile universe with these great armored ships. So everyone seemed to really kick off on the aesthetic for it, the vibe for it very strongly, and since we had such a strong vibe for the Imperial side of thing, one of the challenges was coming up with an equally strong one for the Chaos faction. We look back at the Horus Heresy stuff, the old Adeptus Titanicus and things like that, and we didn't want to quite go down the route of having just, you know, the same ships in a different colour. In original Adeptus Titanicus style, we wanted to have a Chaos faction that was different. And the idea was that it was going to be contemporary 40k anyway, not set back in the Heresy. So we came up with designs for the Chaos side, which were kind of reminiscent of, you know, what the Imperium is using now, but actually slightly more modern looking, because that's the way things were back in the Great Crusade, when most of their ships were built before they went rogue and disappeared off into the Eye of Terror and things like that. Whereas we imagined over time, a lot of the Imperial ships have kind of gone down a different route and developed a different set of aesthetics and a different set of tactics as well. And that last part's very important, because the other thing I wanted to happen was to make sure that the two factions in the box played very differently to each other. They weren't both trying to do the same thing all the time. Because there is, obviously, if you're going to do Space Battle of Jutland, there is a danger that you just end up in two lines throwing lead at each other, which I'm not entirely opposed to, it must be so. But I felt it'd be exciting if there were a bit of a variation on that, and the two sides did it slightly differently. So I took some inspiration from Trafalgar, where, of course, Nelson famously leads two lines line ahead in the way you do not fight naval battles to break the enemy line, rather than trying to just lie alongside it and exchange shot. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. That gives a really interesting dynamic, because you've got the kind of line doing the classic. They've already got their T crossed, so they can throw as much firepower as possible. Can the other side make it through and actually break them up and start using their broadsides fore and aft? So there was a dynamic there that I thought would be good to engage with. We made the Chaos side the one with the more firepower and the better speed even. But the Imperials got their armoured prows, they got their torpedoes to balance that off. And sure enough, it did make a really interesting dynamic between the two sides of them. Again, something I'm very proud of is that out of the box, two cruisers aside, you can have a really interesting game just with that. And then obviously it scales up as well, you get into battleships and all the rest of it. But the aesthetics stay the same. So that all worked really well, and I don't want to just sound like I'm polishing my own end here too much, but I was really, really pleased. I was so happy with the way it all came out. We did Armada as well, which is a supplemental book. Yeah, I should talk about other fleets as well, because the other thing that we did was we did the Xeno fleets. Again, coming from Epic, I thought it was very important that we represent not just Imperial and Chaos factions, but aliens too. And for the core rules, we got Eldar and Orcs into them, which are the key too. I got Jervis to design the Eldar, and I asked him to make them as annoying as possible. And I was inspired by the old Steve Jackson game, Ogre in GEV, where in that the GEVs hover tanks, basically. They can kind of move out, attack, and then move back again. And they're not terribly powerful in themselves, but they're terribly annoying because they can just whoop, blam, whoop. Which again, we've been doing variants of that in 40k for the Eldar with pop-up attacks and things like that. Not just in 40k, but in Epic as well over the years. So it seemed appropriate that their spaceships, again, were annoying. They could wobble out, wobble back, and so forth. But at the same time, the old concepts, and I will actually go and dig for them this time, that Jez had done, solar sails feature a lot. So we also had this idea to make them sail-driven. So they were a bit like the old ships of the line, very Napoleonic in that thing.
So I think the way the Eldar are described in certainly like some of the old 40k codexes,
Yeah.
you've got that kind of nimbleness and agility.
Absolutely.
And that's really reflected on the...
It's all rapier versus broadsword sort of stuff. Don't worry about that. So they had that hollow field. Yes, you can go and dig for the appropriate concepts and flash them up at the same time. Yeah.
There we go, yeah.
So, yeah, rapier versus broadsword sort of stuff. And sure enough, every bit of feedback I've ever had is like, they're annoying. To the extent that some of the people are still playing Battlefleet Gothic, God bless them. And some of them go for like, no, we don't want move, shoot, move. We just give them move, move, shoot. The devil with you and your devilish ways. Which is fine, guys. You know, always play a game the way you want to, but you're missing the point slightly. Bring more weapon batteries. That's the way to deal with them. Because Lancers are rubbish against Eldar. They miss because of the hollow fields. Anyway. So that was Eldar. Orcs I did myself, and that was comparatively easy. I just made them the equivalent of, okay, you've got a broadsword. I'm throwing breeze blocks at you. How do you deal with that? They're really unsubtle, just all kind of front punchy things. One of the things that I picked up from previous spaceship games I've done was if you put guns coming out the front of spaceships all the time, then they end up just doing that all the time, and you end up trying to do something that's like stupid fighter combat, which is one of the reasons that originally I wanted to stick with broadsides for the Imperials as being their primary methodology. If that makes no sense in comparison to what I was talking about before, it's because when the Imperials actually break the line, their weapon batteries and stuff, yes, they're broadside, but they're comparatively short range compared to the Chaos faction, so that's why they're better breaking the line. Plus you get bonuses for shooting at people from the front and the rear because of deflection. So yeah, Orcs really unsettle, ram ships, kill cruisers, that kind of thing. And again, you can find pictures of them online because they all look like fists. They're there to fist you. And then in Armada, we actually got spread out more. We did Space Marines, we did Tau, we did Necrons as well, because they were all coming up at the time in 4K. And yeah, we carried on doing a series of magazines. Warp Storm as well, which I think is those just compiled.
Yeah, it's just a collection, isn't it, I think?
Yeah, and stuff carried on for a while. But sadly, as with everything at that time with secondary games, it was kind of, in terms of me directly supporting it and working on it, I got dragged away to work on other stuff, 40k and things like that, within a year. So.
Because at this point, it was kind of under the umbrella of Fanatic, wasn't it?
It passed basically from the main studio onto Fanatic. And then after that, in effect, to Forgeworld, because they carried on making ships for it, like even after Fanatic was gone.
Yeah, like the Demiurgs and things like that, didn't they?
That's right. We did, and we did other, minor alien races, like the Demiurg, which was, again, League of Votan, as you know them now. But that was me and not me and Jervis, me and Jazz's secret agenda to try and push squats back into the game, basically under a different guise and having a bit of a rework, really. Which, again, it's funny to see it happening now, 20 years on.
Full circle.
It all comes full circle in the end, which is why I suspect that Games Workshop, much as they've done a new Adeptus Titanis game, I imagine they'll do a new Battlefleet Gothic game set in the Horus Heresy at some point, probably different scales. Speaking of scales, well, when we look at the Righteous Endeavour there, grand old lady, a little bit bent and wobbly as she is, that was originally intended to be a cruiser. That ended up being the battleship scale. These are cruisers in the finished game, so it ended up being the battleship. Oh, that's another one that's worth seeing. I scratch built some escorts as well, and the glories of actually being in the system got them cast up. So I had some sword class things that I built, again, out of bits of spaceship and epic parts. I was quite proud of them though. I did a Cobra Destroyer as well. And I picked out these two plastics specifically. This is Dave Andrews, did a marvellous engineering job in that he made a basic hull frame and then plug-in weapon batteries, which is what me and Jez have been talking about for years. So we have a carrier here, Mars-class carrier, battle cruiser, technically speaking, and a lunar-class cruiser. The only difference is that you get like spine turrets on a battle cruiser. But the reason I picked these two out, sorry to get back to the point, was obviously with all those different weapon sets you could have different configurations. We thought rather than just leave people to try and slap them on together and maybe make bad ones or make super overpowered ones, like I'm going to take all carrier parts. Yeah, we could see that one coming. We did preset ones, so in many ways the lunar class cruiser is intended to be like the Sherman tank of cruiser designs for the Imperium, at least in the Gothic sector. It's absolute bog standard, and so it's got weapon batteries, it's got lance batteries, it's got torpedoes on the front. Okay, bog standard. But to my surprise, it's actually one of the most effectual cruisers you can take on the Imperial side. Its bog standardness is its defence to a large extent, because it can handle anything on a certain level. It's cheap comparatively to a lot of other cruisers, and it's not a one-trick pony. So I actually got tremendous use out of the Lunars, more so than most of the others. I'm sure other people will disagree with me on that front and go, no, they're rubbish, but for me they always work really well. And the Mars was another classic example of something where it's got this sort of like mismatch of, it's got some launch bays, it's got some weapon batteries, it's got some lance turrets on the top. Okay, it's got a Nova cannon on the front, which is exciting, but it's a bit of a jack of all trades. It shouldn't really be that good at anything. But again, it always performed amazingly for me. So it's got a very dear place in my heart, that Mars has. It actually won entire battles on its own occasionally. So yeah, yes, had a lot of fun times with this. I actually played at Adepticon, I think back in 2016. Somebody brought along their ships and specifically said, you know, find some time at the end of the show and just play me, please.
Yeah, nice.
And it was really nice going back and playing it again, because I'd kind of, in the intervening time, I'd done Dropfleet Commander as well. Specifically, the guys at Hawk had asked me to do it because they really love Gothic. So in many ways, I got another bite at the cherry of making a tabletop spaceship game in a similar sort of vein. And there's a fair amount of things that are different in Dropfleet Commander, but it did embody a lot of the things that I'd thought subsequently about, having done the Battlefleet Gothic rules, how, if I had my time again, I'd do it again. But at the end of the day, I have to say, they're both equally good games in different ways. Dropfleet Commander handles a bigger fleet a bit better. It's got far more fragile ships in them that they just blow up all over the place. I kind of over-egged it a bit on that front. I have this thing, basically, where if you're doing a game and you've got things, tanks, ships, whatever, that project firepower, you have to work to make sure people don't clump up too much, because that's what you should do. The logical thing is, like, you put them into as small a space as possible so that you dominate the space fully. You can't get guys picked off on the edges. Okay, looks terrible. Looks really terrible, really detrimental to the visuals of the game. Boring as well. So I try to give people reasons to spread out. And rather cruelly with spaceship games, ships blowing up is the reason I came up with for them, which kind of works on these guys okay. They're hard to take down in the first place. It was one of the things that worked out really well. I've had a whole diatribe with Jervis about how Brace for Impact actually fundamentally alters the game and makes it more interesting. And when they go down, they go down hard, certainly, but they're not liable to be in the midst of a great clump of other ships unless you're unlucky and you get a really bad die roll and it blows up and the warp core goes, and then it's an event. But because of the dynamics of the game doesn't work out so bad, In Dropfleet Commander, things just go like popcorn, as they call it, in that one thing will blow up, and then it'll blow up the next thing, and then the next thing, and the next thing, which is kind of hilarious in itself, but a little bit more than I'd kind of intended, really. Yeah, over-egged it a bit on the damage front. And that was kind of what I enjoyed, was that dynamically they felt like very different games. These felt like giant armoured trains throwing shells at each other, which took a lot of poking holes in to take down. Whereas the Dropfleet Commander ships do feel a lot more like modern warships, where it's like a couple of 3 big hits and we're gone, boys. You know, we're going to be like an expanding cloud of gas any moment now. So I guess theme appropriate, and it just comes down to which game you prefer playing and how you like your death served up, you know, cold or extended.
Again, they both fit that, like, the aesthetic of their...
I always feel that's really important in a game. That's your first stop. What are you doing it for?
Yeah, you look at the artwork of the front cover, you know, like the box set there that John did, and that's what draws you in, you know. And we kind of talked about the cathedrals on top of the ships, and there is the whole kind of religious element of 40k that, you know...
Oh, yeah, it's very easier to... Well, this is, again, it's why the 18th century sailing ships and stuff like that was something of an inspiration, particularly when we were writing the background for them. Anywhere up to 50% of the crew would die on any given voyage in the 18th century. You know, illness, disease, scurvy, stabbing each other. So it was a tremendously dangerous undertaking to do long sea voyages, and the idea of the crew being like cooped up on these giant spaceships and literally going through hell as they went from one place to another for an unknown amount of time because of the tides of the warp. It could be, you know, oh, we get there in 3 weeks, or it could be we get there in 17 years, or it could be we get there in 1,000 years, or we get there 500 years before we set out. You know, they don't know exactly what's going to land up at the other end of them. Most of them don't know that they're even in the warp half the time, but things are getting nightmarish and things like that. So they're real kind of horror factors on that level. So the level of discipline that you would need, or not, as the case may be, in those environments. And it was a compelling environment. And like I say, we had great imagery for what the guys actually looked like as well. So yes, it sold itself on so many levels on that one, and it played into that upper class officer clique type thing, which you see in the Imperial Guard and stuff like that. And guys with very high collars, looking down their nose at you all the time. Lovely stuff.
But going back to, you know, we kind of mentioned about like the Necrons in the tower earlier. I suppose when you kind of started the project, did you have any ambition to go, oh, like, even though we've got the kind of 4 core races in, wouldn't it be great to get some other weird stuff in at some point?
Well, I mean, when I started it, the town in Necrons didn't exist.
They went, of course.
At the outset, it was primarily an Imperials versus the world kind of a game, was the idea. It was just a question of like picking which is your primary opponent for the core game, which Chaos is always the classic one for Imperials. I think it's they're like us, but not like us, and they believe something different.
It's a rivalry, almost, kind of. You know,
exactly.
The Orcs are too alien to...
Yeah, they all have their different bags, whereas it's kind of personal when it comes to the Imperials and Chaos. So, yeah, I was only concentrated on primarily doing Eldar and Orcs at first. The other races came along later. We were very opportunistic, basically.
Sure.
So when we did the town, when we did the Necrons, one of the things I encouraged the guys to think was think about it, not just on the 40k tabletop level. You know, how do they fight the epic scale battles? How do they fight in space? Because even if we don't make those games, we kind of need to know for writing the background, doing the history, and all the rest of it, is at least have an idea of it.
It all ties in.
Yeah, it all ties in, or it will do at some point. And so it came as a natural extension out of that to, you know, do different shit. And it's not a huge job, or it wasn't a huge job to come up with a different set of dynamics for each of the different fleets as they came out. Pete Haynes did most of the legwork on Tower Necrons, certainly. They were very much his babies. Space Marine fleet was kind of a joint effort, as I recall.
I suppose, yeah, you know, it must be rewarding for you knowing that the game is still so popular after all these years. And
it really is. It warms my heart, genuinely does, that people are still playing it and enjoying it as well. As with most of the abandoned Games Workshop games, there's been a community, you know, cropped up They maintain a rule book for it. Hi, Jeeves. And so it's an ongoing endeavour. And as I say, 3D printing kind of breathes new life into people who want to collect ships, because they can just print off the ships they always wanted. They don't have to collect them in metal. But some people do love getting the originals as well. So there's a big second-hand market out there for Battlefleet Gothic ships, which is all just really sweet. But I think it just speaks to the fact we did a very fine job, a collective teamwork on it, because it was at a point when the studio was really producing great stuff, great combinations. So, that's Battlefleet Gothic for me. Happy memories overall.